Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our third Afternoon Tertulia. I'm your host, Kimberly Roa, Centro Special Projects Coordinator. We're so excited to have you here today, and we hope you're ready to get into it as sociologist Eduardo Bonilla-Silva and Centro Directora Yarimar Bonilla discuss Eduardo's career trajectory, his relationship to Centro, and the current projects that he is focusing on. After this conversation, we'll hold a Q&A where you can ask Yarimar and Eduardo questions about what was discussed today. We'd also like to take a moment to invite you to join us next week for two upcoming events. On October 26th at 12 p.m., we'll be hosting a library lunch hour with Dr. Elizabeth Taveras Rivera on how to use the Centro Digital Archives. And October 27th at 5 p.m., we'll be celebrating the historical event at Madison Square Garden between the African American community and the Puerto Rican community in support of decolonizing Puerto Rico. We'll drop the link in the chat for both of these events so you can RSVP as soon as possible. Without further ado, please help me welcome Eduardo and Yarimar.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. Welcome everyone to this very special tertulia. As you may have noticed this semester at Centro, we have been experimenting with different formats. On Monday, we had our first hybrid event where we had folks in person and joining via Zoom. And today we're having a kind of a intimate conversation. Part of what I wanted to do in these Tertulia series was not just to present original research, but to also have one-on-one conversations with authors and prominent scholars to get to know them a little bit more, understand their trajectory, and get a deeper sense of what shapes their research. We started our first tertulia this month with Sheriana Feliciano, and that will be posted soon on our website. And today we are very honored to have Eduardo Bonilla-Silva. No relation, but a lot of connection. And I'm so excited to have Eduardo virtually with us tonight. I should say I had never met Eduardo before we had this occasion of doing this dialogue, and I am so grateful for his generosity of time and spirit and for being available for this event because I know he's very busy and very solicited scholar. Now, the event tonight will start with a pre-recorded conversation between myself and Eduardo. We pre-recorded to make sure there were no technical glitches and to edit it a little bit to incorporate some images. So get ready to see some baby pictures of Eduardo, and we will have extensive conversation, and big thanks to Waldo Cabrera from our media team for editing that conversation. And then we will have a live Q&A, although you can start queuing up your questions throughout the conversation. So let me take a minute to introduce Eduardo, even though I know for many who have tuned in tonight, he needs no introduction. But Eduardo Bonilla-Silva is the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Duke University and former president of the American Sociological Association and the Southern Sociological Society. He has been the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including the 2007 Louis A. Kosser Award for Theoretical Agenda Setting, the 2011 Cox Johnson Fraser Award for Outstanding Work in Fields Focused on Social Justice, and most recently, the W.E.B. Du Bois A Career of Distinguished Scholarship Award. All of these were awarded by the American Sociological Association. Eduardo's first publication is a landmark Rethinking Racism toward a Structural Interpretation, a 1997 article in the journal American Sociological Review, became an instant classic, helping move the field away from the prejudice, problematic, and into what we call these days systemic racism. His first book, White Supremacy in the Post-Civil Rights Era, was the 2002 winner of the Oliver Cromwell Cox Award. His second book, Racism Without Racists, Colorblind Racism and the Persistence of Racial Inequality in America, will soon appear in a 6th edition and is a 2-time Choice Award winner. I did not even know you could win Choice Award 2 times, 2004 and 2015. And that book has become a classic in the field of race studies, influencing scholars in fields as diverse as education, political science, rhetoric, psychology, English, religious studies, and legal studies, among others. His other books include White Out, The Continuing Significance of Racism, published in 2003, and White Logic, White Methods, Racism and Methodology, published in 2008, as well as The State of White Supremacy, Racism, Governance, and the United States in 2011. His research has also appeared in numerous journals, including the American Sociological Review, Sociological Inquiry, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Journal of Latin American Studies, Critical Sociology, and Sociology of Race and Ethnicity. So as you can see, Eduardo stays very busy, and we had a long and extended conversation about his career, but I should note that he is celebrated and beloved by many, not just for his academic contributions, but because, as one of his students wrote, he is a public intellectual who keeps it real. And so as you will see in our conversation tonight, he does not disappoint. So please enjoy and queue up your questions. Thank you. To get to know you a little bit better, can we start with your family background? Can you tell us a little bit about where you were born and where you grew up?
Probably some people in the audience know, but I'm assuming most people don't know, that I was born in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. You probably can detect my Bellefonte accent the way I speak. No, I was born 59 years ago because my parents were studying at Penn State. But I was truly raised in Puerto Rico because I was in the US only 9 months. So as a baby, they took me back to Puerto Rico. And my fundamental socialization was mixed. Half my life as a youngster was in the subdivision called San Gerardo in Rio Piedras. So, and then the other half in Barrio Caimito, a rural barrio in San Juan. That sort of produced a lot of the confusions in my style because I got the urban middle class element half my life, and the other half was rural working class in Barrio Caimito.
And tell us about your parents. They're both academics, no?
Yeah, my mother, rest in peace, she was a sociologist, and she and I had plenty. Those of you who read some of my work on race in Puerto Rico know that I had my issues with my mother, but she was a sociologist, and in many ways I'm a sociologist because of her. She was a deep influence, both positive and negative in my life. She was a star in Puerto Rican sociology. So all of you who know the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras, know that being a professor there means that you teach 4 and 4, yeah? So it's a heavy teaching load. So my mother was able to produce a few books in her trajectory, and one of them titled Hay Amores que Matan, La Violencia Doméstica en Puerto Rico, was a minor classic and fundamental in the discussion and later on for the enactment of the law against domestic violence in Puerto Rico. My father was a chemist. He taught chemistry for 37 years in Puerto Rico. And in my life, he was the black man in my family. So, and he was a black man of education who became, as I call him in a fight, un negro oficial, an official black man, because he accepted the notion of negro pero decente, black but decent. So that position assigned to him by the white side of the family, he sort of never objected to it. He only objected to discrimination and racism when affecting his money. Then he fought. But on anything else, he was sort of okay and made transactions that in retrospect he should have made. But anyway, I could go on that because that's part of the discussion of race and family life. But
let's pause there for a minute. Actually, tell us a little bit more about that. And I'm wondering, el ser negro pero decente, he identified overtly as black, and did you grow up with a kind of consciousness of being a black Puerto Rican?
Absolutely not. As you know, in Puerto Rico, we have, things are changing somewhat. I hope we discuss that later. They're changing somewhat, but we still don't have a discursive space to talk, think, and process race. Race is a category, but it's not a category like in the US, So therefore, most people, including people that we would call Black, object to the category itself. And it's the only element in which left, right, and center in Puerto Rico agree. So the conservatives, the pro-Commonwealth, and the pro-independent and socialists agree, let's not talk about race. We don't have that in Puerto Rico. So my father, Black, but doesn't mean he lived his life as a Black man. He was just Black because he was Black from a Black family. But the discussion of Blackness and how it affects your life was not central to his thinking. So as you know, that's part of your own work, you know, that the diffuse racial consciousness that we exhibit, that's what my father had. In some moments, he would exhibit consciousness in diffuse, contradictory fashion. For the most part, race was not the modality in which he understood a lot of the discrimination and pain he suffered in life. Yeah.
I really appreciate you saying that, because it really resonates with my experiences as well, with my own father, who's deceased now, but who is also Black and experienced a lot of discrimination. He was, you know, he was given very racialized nicknames when he was growing up, but that didn't necessarily lead to a kind of affirmative, you know, racialized consciousness for him, or the transmission of that to me in my family. It was really, and you know, my own racial identity, I had to come to it through my own path and through my own travels.
Same with me. So you and I share that. Some of it is coming to the US where race is in your face, and then you sort of gain more consciousness, read, and rethink your life, yeah? And it's not that we Black ontologists in Puerto Rico don't know that race affects our life. Is that we don't have the tools and even the space to talk, think, and process racialized events. So let's, I mean, jumping all over the place.
Yeah, we don't have to stay linear. We can roll.
So let's talk about race and families. Yeah, in the US, which is, unfortunately, people think that the US is central to race thinking and formation in the world. It is, but it is not, in that practically there are more societies that exhibit the characteristics of Puerto Rico, Cuba, Mexico, Brazil, Spain, France, etc. Countries that claim to be colorblind, yet are deeply and profoundly racialized. So in Puerto Rico, in terms of extended families, I'm going to use my family as an example. I have one white side with some variance, and a Black side with some variance. I wrote about this in the article in the Afro-Latino Reader. When you go to a wedding or a funeral, you immediately realize the tables, yeah? The white table, the Black tables. You see the social distance. You see, unfortunately, the deference that the Black side tends to pay to the white side. My family, my mother is a light-skinned mulatta, was a light-skinned mulatta. So although in elite spaces she was Black, in normative Puerto Rico, she was just a light-skinned person, quasi-white, even not, though she would not be viewed by white as a white person by most people. So that means that we sat on the white side of the tables, and then I had to migrate to the Black side to see the rest of my family, yeah? And resources, because you also realize and ponder, why is that the white side of my family does better than the Black side? So the white side tends to have more money, more education, on the Black side. Again, my father and mother exceptions, yeah, they became the exceptional Blacks. They became the Barack Obama of our family. Yeah? So they were then allowed to be in the white side of the tables, as I mentioned, on the negro pero decente. And education matters, but also matters when you are a professor. Yeah, it's like, wow, your parents are professors in the University of Puerto Rico. Of course, people don't walk around with signs saying special Black person with a degree, professor of the university. Yeah? So my father had to deal with the fact that in some spaces, his education sort of gave them some standing, but in the mean streets of Puerto Rico, everyday Puerto Rico, he was just a Black guy in stores, in streets, in neighborhoods, yeah? My brother was Indian looking. In a country like Mexico or Bolivia, he wouldn't be viewed as Indian, but in Puerto Rico, he was Indian because he's a light-skinned trigueño with a pelo lacio, straight hair, but coarse straight hair. My sister, very light-skinned, but because she had light skin, she then can do some maneuvers that I, for example, couldn't. So of the three siblings, I was the darkest one, closest in looks and phenotype to my dad. So I lived my life for the most part as a sort of a Black man, particularly in the middle-class environments where my family sort of moved. That's where the sting of race was more intense, because racism also has a class connotation, yeah? In poorer environments, although race matters everywhere, in poorer environments, there is more flexibility. So,
And what high school did you go to, Eduardo?
at the university high school, that's painful because it was 6 years of soledad, of loneliness, because since I was one of the few dark folks in the school, it meant that when I fell in love with lighter skinned girls, and there were not many Black girls in school, plus I was also a racialized person. So in terms of the object of desire, desire is constructed in a racialized manner. So the lighter skinned girls were the ones that were viewed as bonitas, beautiful, yeah? So, but that meant that I couldn't have girlfriends. So I basically, in my high school, didn't have any girlfriend. So my barrio was my salvation because I got a bit more plurality and I was accepted as me, as Black and beautiful and handsome me. But in my school, I wasn't Black, beautiful and handsome. I was just Eduardo. So some of the people in the audience remember, for example, that TV series, Roots, that was so fundamental in the US. For me, Roots was pain, because as soon as I went to school, they are like, hey, Kunta Kinte, te cortaron el pie. Hey, Kunta Kinte, they cut your leg, whatever. So my first fist fight as a boy, as a young man, was in school because someone was taunting me about Kunta Kinte this, Kunta Kinte that, you know.
Your father, he didn't, really have a kind of racialized language to think about his identity. And so did you start already having this kind of, developing a racialized consciousness about, the importance and the particular experience of being a Black Puerto Rican at this point, or did that come much later?
Like most Black Puerto Ricans in the period that I grew up, the 70s particularly, there was no space, there were no tools. So what you had was this confusion, yeah? That occasionally, because remember, we do talk about racism, we don't call it racism, we call it prejudice, yeah? I fought initially in my own home with my parents, because I noticed that affection and resources were apportioned based on phenotype. So I wasn't getting much love and much resources. And I fought, again, without having the language to recognize what was going on. Yeah, now 30, 40 years later, I can name it. So one of my former students wrote this book, Elizabeth Horch Freeman. The title is The Color of Love, El Color del Amor. And she interviewed Black families, and she found that Black families internalized racism and apportion resources and affection based on color. So the lighter kids in the family may be sent to college, whereas the dark kids are not. And they're told, well, we don't have enough money to send everybody, so we send Paquita, because Paquita is beautiful and smart, and you are not that beautiful and you're not that smart, so you can work and get a regular working class job, yeah? Think about young kids not being able to understand why Abuela doesn't seem to like me. Why I have one of my former students, now professor, I'm telling you what he told me. His grandmother kept telling his daughter, negra sucia. Horrible, yeah?
Wow.
So a mother referring to her daughter in such a despicable way, and then the kids listening to this. By the way, I have been talking about this in Latin America. If there are Black people in the audience, African Americans, they should relate to this too, because that happens also in Black families. The student I mentioned, the book on the color of love, when she was collecting the data, she called me from Brazil to tell me, hey, Eduardo, I'm going to change the subject. I'm going to do something else. I'm like, why? And she told me because as she started gathering data and transcribing the material, she realized, oh my God, that happened to me too. I'm getting emotional. Let's talk about books and things like that before I cry.
I know, but I appreciate that so much, and we'll get back to your to your writings about race in Puerto Rico, which are so personal and so emotional. But before we get there, let's stay on your trajectory. So you did your high school at the High School of the University of Puerto Rico, which is where mostly children of university professors go, and I assume that your mother being academic and your father being a chemist, we didn't mention his profession, but he was also a university professor, right? And that must have been your access to there. And then for your college education, you decided to stay at the University of Puerto Rico.
I didn't decide. I had no option.
Okay.
As a general rule, only elites send their kids to study in the US. The rest, the 95% of us, stay in the island. And in part, my parents literally told me, hey, if you go to the UPR, it's free. And to be honest, I had no interest in going to the US because in 1979, when I graduated from high school, my English was extremely limited. Not like now when I'm so fluent. I have no accent. I'm just perfect.
No accent, yes.
Yeah, but in 1979, I wouldn't even think of. Plus, I was a nationalist at the time, so I would never think of going to the US to study, going to what Martí called las entrañas del monstruo. So it wasn't in my radar. But sociology was an aftermath. I tried everything that I could to avoid sociology, in part because my mother was a professor at the time, and I didn't want to be viewed as, oh, Eduardo is doing well because of his mother. So I began in political science, and I took the first course in political science, and I thought it was a disaster. They didn't know squat. So because of that, I actually dropped the class. I still remember like it was yesterday. The professor came to explain to me why you're dropping. And she was an older person, a good friend of my mother. So rather than telling her the truth, I lied. I told her that it was that the discussion was too intense for me. In truth, I thought that the discussion was too stupid for me and I wasn't going to gain anything.
And who are your peers at that time?
I'll give you a few names. Nobody knows them because none of them, became a central figure in Puerto Rican life, but they were my friends. Mario Rivera, who is now a lawyer. Janet Rodriguez, who is now got a PhD in library sciences and works in the library in the UPR. And then at the time I was a member of the FUPI, the Federación de Universitarios, the pro-independent student organization. So all the people in the FUPI were also my friends. And then for a while, I sort of contemplated joining the rival organization, Unión de Juventudes Socialistas, UJS. So some of the people there became also my friends. So, but during my university time, then I had friends in college, but also friends outside.
Tell us a little bit about the political, organizations and movements that you were involved in during that time.
Well, as I mentioned, I was a member of the Federación de Universitarios Pro Independencia for about a year. And at some point, they thought I was going to be the next president until I dared to criticize the organization and to criticize the Partido Socialista Puertorriqueño. And we were sort of the branch the student branch of that group, yeah.
What were your critiques?
I objected to the nationalist position of the group. I thought that we should have been a clearly Marxist organization, and that our connection to the Partido Socialista it was not a healthy connection, because we were just distributing their newspaper, Claridad. So we had this to be or not to be. We are not, but we are. And I said, either we are, and if we are the branch of the Partido Socialista Puertorriqueño, I'm out. And if we are not, then we need to enhance our commitment to Marxism. So because of that, I said some things that I prefer not to mention tonight. And when I said what I said, they told me, okay, this is enough. We heard you. So you're out. They kicked me out. At the time, I was about to be sent to Cuba. There was a possibility of going to Cuba and study economics, Martian economics. So I was like asking, hey, can I still go to Cuba? And like, no, man, if you're out, you're out.
And what was the racial climate like at UPR at that time? Was there thinking about racial studies? You know, there's now a programa de afrodescendencia at UPR.
There was no space. Until recently, as you probably know, there was no one teaching courses on race in sociology, for example, or political science, or any other social science for that matter. And I'm not going to lie, I was not part of any kind of group trying to push for us to bring a racial angle to anything. I was just a young socialist for whom class was everything. So I remember my first time I heard people like Doris Pizarro, who was a member of the Partido Socialista Puertorriqueño, and she was one of the first people I heard talking about racism in Puerto Rico. And my reaction, again, now 40 years later, is funny, but my reaction was like, what is this woman doing? She's dividing the working class. We should be concentrated on class and avoid secondary contradictions such as class and gender. So now, again, 40 years later, I can laugh about my own position, but that was my initial reaction when I heard people like Doris Pizarro talking about race in Puerto Rico.
Aside from la FUPI and las huelgas de la universidad, you were also involved in the movement for Villa Sin Miedo, no?
I was a student who got involved, not through the FUPI, but through my own interest in the rescate de terrenos, called Villa Sin Miedo, who was, anyone who is old enough remembers, in the 1981, it was a moment of land rescues, land invasions, using the term used by the government, yeah? And so I participated in that movement, and I was one of the students arrested, and we had a horrible court case that lasted from 1981 till 1993. And the case was finally settled, and we were finally exonerated. But it took 12 years of my life.
Wow, wow. And what had pulled you to that community in particular, to that cause in particular?
In the 1980s, there was a debate that continues between those who want to define the working class in a very narrow, productivist way, meaning the workers are those who work in factories and produce surplus value. And those of us, and I was sort of at the beginning of my thinking on that, claiming that the working class has to be expanded, that we cannot minimize the size of the class. In that connection, I decided part of the working class is this movement that we are calling Poor People's Movement. Yeah? And it was a moment that we had the number of strikes, big strikes in Puerto Rico. And on my side, I decided to then join this community because I thought it was important for us, the so-called progressives, to be with the people. So it was a very humbling experience, but it was also a very educational experience.
And so tell me about how, after being at the university, being involved in Villa Sin Miedo, you then find yourself in the US in grad school.
Because of my influence of the structural tradition of people like Torresillas, I dreamt of going to France. The problem was that, A, I don't speak French, and B, they don't offer fellowships. So when I asked Professor Torresillas, how can I go and study in France? I'm like, easy, you go and you'll pick up the language in a year. And I asked him, so what about money? I'm like, oh, no problem. You go there and you'll find a woman who will support you. I'm like, what do you mean? Oh, they exchange services for tuition. And I was confused. I couldn't believe the professor was saying that. Oh, no, I don't think I want to do that. So the other option was Mexico, which also would have been good in terms of language, but the same problem, Mexico doesn't offer fellowships. So because of that, then the US became the option. And I went to Wisconsin to work with the late Eric Olin Wright, who basically came to Puerto Rico and gave a series of talks. And he sort of recruited me and said, hey, you should come to Wisconsin. Don't go to Chicago. Come to Wisconsin. I'll train you.
Tell us a little bit about your dissertation work and what you ended up doing as a grad student.
Well, the first thing I learned quickly is that being a Marxist is not all that you think it is, meaning that I went to work with Olin Wright, and in a week, I realized, this is not going to work. I'm still transitioning. I'm still not clear on the impact of race in my own life and in the US, except that every Puerto Rican coming to the US is quickly told, hey man, watch out, because these gringos are racistas, whatever, So I was with my antenna really, high. And literally, Eric Olin Wright sees me in the hallway and says, hello, Eduardo, how are you doing? And I'm like, why you talk to me like that? And then he's like, because I know that English is not your first language. I realized this is not going to work because this guy will never treat me as an equal member of the club. So I felt that I had to find an alternative, and I'm like, oh my goodness. I mean, my first month in the US, I already have experienced overt discrimination in the streets, yeah? But I'm now like, wow, it's not only in the streets, it's among the intelligentsia. So I was disappointed and lost until I found a mentor, Professor Charles Kamick, who to this day is more than my mentor. He became my friend. And he taught sociological theory, and he sort of took me under his wing. But he was a theory person, and my dissertation had nothing to do with theory. My dissertation was historical sociology and social movements, and the title was Squatters, Politics, and State Responses, the Political Economy of Squatting in Puerto Rico, 1900 to 1992. And it's an argument I no longer believe, but this was what I wrote. I claimed that the squatters were more peasant in the first moment from 1900 to 1950 or so, and therefore the state was nice to them. And as soon as they became more working class, more active, more political, then the state repressed the heck out of them. In truth, the story is a bit more complicated, and it led me to rethink my own notion of class and class formation. But anyway, that was my dissertation.
And what your dissertation was never published as a book, right?
Yes, that's part of the story of race in the academy. So I got my first job at the University of Michigan. They hired me because they thought that they had hired a person who was a Marxist, but that it was a joint position in sociology and African American studies. So they thought they had fooled the African American studies unit because they hired a Marxist guy who could teach the race course, and that was it. In truth, I was a scholar in transition in 1993, transitioning from a vulgar Marxist, to a person who says class matters, but race does too. And I wanted to understand the race stuff in the US and in the world, yeah? So when I got my book out and I submitted for publication, I got a contract from the University of Florida Press. So I was all excited. And I got an interest expressed by University of California Press. So when I talked to my white senior colleagues, they told me, ignore Florida. We don't give a darn about Florida. Florida will never be taken seriously here. The only presses that count at Michigan are Chicago, Princeton, Harvard, and that was and California. That was about it. Yeah, I ignored the offer from Florida and focused on California Press. I kept working with them. 6 months later, literally, I called. I'm concerned. I'm in my third year, and I had not gotten my feedback on the book. So I called the press and I asked, "Can I talk to?" And I remember it like this day, the name of the person. "Can I talk to Colleen Trujillo?" And they're like, "Who? Let me check." And it probably took 10 minutes, but in my mind, my heart, it looked like 1 hour. So after a while, they come back and like, "Well, we got the story now. Ms. Trujillo left the California Press 3 months ago and left the records all over the place. So if you want, you can resubmit the book and we'll begin the process from scratch." You can imagine, Yarimar, you know the academy, so you do the math, it's like, oh my goodness.
Yeah, I think anyone who's published a academic book right now is just like, that's like the worst thing you can imagine. Yes.
So basically, dead man walking. I knew that in terms of that book, I'm out. And of course, after that, I consulted with people outside and they told me, "Why didn't you check with us?" So later on, I did due diligence and check whether or not all my colleagues published their books with Harvard, Chicago, etc. And the truth is, as always, more complex. Half of them did, but half of them did publish their books with Routledge and other presses. And I'm like, Routledge? That's not even an academic press. And to this day, I'm mad because my career probably would have been more, people don't know me as a scholar in Latin American studies or Latino studies, in part because of that trajectory. Had I published that book, I would have joined in the discussion on Latin American Caribbean studies, and then probably I would have had a more plural career with one foot on the Caribbean Latin American studies and the other one in sort of race stuff in the US. When I moved to my next job in Texas A&M, by then I was already totally committed to race studies and the book disappeared.
I appreciate this story so much. First, I appreciate your description of yourself as a scholar in transition, because I feel like there's this expectation, that we're supposed to know everything and have all our analysis, straight from the beginning. And the truth is that we stumble around, we develop, we write things that later we think differently about. So I really appreciate that. And it's also this kind of alternative scenario of, the path not taken, what would have been a different career trajectory had you gone on to publish your dissertation as a book. But so tell us a little bit more about, okay, thanks to this one editor, Ms. Trujillo at University of California Press, your original book did not get published. And so then, what happened and why did it go the way that it did?
The problem ultimately wasn't her, it was my department. My department, Michigan, should have told me, "Hey man, it's okay to publish your first book with Florida." He said, if anyone knows about Latin American studies, there are like 3 presses that are central. One is University of Texas Press, University of North Carolina Press, and then the third one, I think, is University of Florida Press. And by the way, it wasn't the only bad feedback I got. My first publication ever, my article, Rethinking Racism, had I followed their advice, it would have never been published because all of them were telling me there is nothing here, racism is not a scientific concept, so I don't know why you're wasting your time with this and that. And then the article ended up being published in the top journal of sociology. And at this point, it has like 3,000 citations, but who's counting? Yeah?
I think that's a story a lot of folks can identify with. Yeah, and in fact, such a lesson that sometimes, the things that cause the most discomfort among our colleagues that are, put down, we're told that we shouldn't pursue them, are the ones that will define our careers and that we will be most known for, precisely because of the feathers that they're ruffling, right?
Two of my books or important publications came of work that I outlined when I was in grad school. My Rethinking Race in Peace, which is in ASR now, has been since 1997. That piece that some people think is the only thing I have done, of course, I have done a few more things, but that thing was drafted in 1991 when I was in grad school. The other work that at the time when I was in Wisconsin, people were mad with me was a methodological critique of the way we measure and address racism. And that's the foundation for the book that I co-edited with Tukubu Zuberi, White Logic, White Methods. So it's interesting that two things that were shut down while I was in grad school ended up being big hits in my own career. So young scholars, you got to believe in yourself, because if you don't, no one else will.
Yeah, and I should mention that there is a reading group that is being led by one of our Centro visiting scholars on white logics, white methods, and we'll be putting that information in the chat for folks who want to read more about that piece. But so to tell us a little bit more about how then you move from thinking about Villa Sin Miedo and you know, squatters as workers to the work that you've become most known for, which is thinking about racism in the United States, questioning colorblindness, and moving towards a different understanding of racial relations.
I came as a vulgar Marxist for whom everything was class. To this day, I remember when I was in a class fighting, we were reading Angela Davis's book, Race, Class, and Something. And I took the side that when someone was using the notion of patriarchy, I'm like, wait a second. The Marxists have the notion of mode of production, which is clear and tangible. I don't know what the hell you mean by patriarchy. Is it like a mode of production? Can you elaborate? And I was arguing like a vulgar Marxist that then highlighting gender was making a secondary contradiction primary, and that would be divisive. And of course, they ate me alive. I almost cried. I remember, I stood my ground. So I lost the fight, but I learned, because then after that, I'm like, you know what? Maybe, just maybe, I need to think deeper about this idea of gender, which I did. Same with race, yeah. So with race, initially, I just couldn't get it. And then in 1988, there was a student movement in the University of Wisconsin after an incident. And we created a group called the Minority Coalition. And I was the president. So as president, I represented the group in that organization. And that was my beginning of thinking and writing about race. And because I was engaged in this social movement activity, I then was forced to read and read and read. And in 1991, I applied to teach a class, and guess what class they gave me? Even though I had no formal training in race, they gave me the race course, even though I was better prepared to teach Introduction to Sociology or Statistics, and they gave me the race course. Wait for it. I asked the woman who assigned me the course, why did you do it? And she told me, because you are a natural.
No formal training, but they thought you were a natural at teaching race?
Yeah, because it's phenotypical. Don't you know that if you're born Black, you have a history of the US, history of Native Americans, history of Chicanos, history of Asian Americans, etc. So it's a part of the racialized thinking in the academy, the assumption that we are sort of naturally gifted with the knowledge and vision on race, yeah?
Well, and it's also the denial of race studies as an academic field with canonical texts, with methods, yeah. And I mean, I have to say, I've had similar experiences, and also being asked to teach gender studies, as if that wasn't also a field with its own, you know, traditions.
Yeah. So I believe in myself, period. And I kept reading and reading and reading. And because I was a free person, that meant that I could mix and match things that people in my field would never dream of. So for example, my first publication, Rethinking Racism Toward Structural Interpretation, has the imprint of my background in structural racism applied to race studies. So at the time, people in the field of race studies were like, wow, this is great. But anyone who knows about the work of Poulantzas or Althusser sees my writing and even the definitions, and I'm like, this seems to be like the stuff that Poulantzas and Althusser wrote about class, extrapolated to race, and they are sort of right. That's what I did.
And so what about the book Racism Without Racist, which is, probably your most well-known publication? How was that also sparked from your thinking around race in graduate school, or how did that come about?
In grad school, I already had sort of moved beyond the prejudice problematic, the assumption that the problem is bad people against good people, to the argument that racism should be viewed fundamentally, I'm talking about racism at the ideological level, as an ideology. Yeah? So I had made that move. I also had I was simpatico with some traditions at the time called the symbolic racism or the modern racism traditions. And these are measures and arguments based on survey data. And because I'm not a survey researcher, I decided, you know what? I want to solidify my work in this field. So let me do something. And I was fortunate enough to be in charge of something called the Detroit Area Study in Michigan. And as part of that work, we did both a survey and interviews. The survey I didn't use much, but the interview material then literally blew my mind. At the time, jokingly, I said someone, it looks like white people go to night school and they learn phrases like, I'm not a racist, but, etc. So I was facing the material, and for a year, I was paralyzed because I didn't see variance, or I saw very little variance. And a lot of the good things that happened in my life happened in dreams. I saw this idea of, hey, ideologies are global, so most people will agree with them. Why are you thinking of variance? So when I woke up, I immediately took notes. Don't forget this is important. And in my notes, I put, you need to think about this as an ideology, and as such, little variance, because most whites will sing a similar tune. And that was the beginning of my thinking of colorblindness.
And so that Racism Without Racism and your arguments about colorblindness, they've become really pivotal within racial studies, landmark texts. How do you feel about the impact that it's had in the academy?
We all work hard, yeah, but there is no guarantee. To this day, I think some of my best work has gone nowhere, and some of the work that I'm not too happy has gone places. So there is an element of Russian roulette and context. For example, had I written this book, Racism Without Racism, just 3-4 years before, it likely would not have gotten anywhere, because the academic community was then controlled by the survey tradition telling them that things are getting better. Now, by the time I published the book in the early 21st part of the 21st century, the space was there to say, you know what? People keep saying that things are better, yet apparently they are not. So the book came at a moment where the space to say and tell the story I told was optimal. The only thing I can tell you is this. I wrote the book differently than book one. Book one, that nobody mentions except people in race studies, is a more traditional book. And it's a book that I gave to my father. My father became the measure for me about whether or not the book is readable. So I asked my father, Papi, ¿leíste el libro? Papi, Dad, did you read my book? And he's like, Eduardo, I'm going to tell you the truth. I read the first 3 pages. It's thick. It's like going through glue. You cannot read this stuff. So since then, I have been like in a conversation with my dad about, I want my books and my stuff to be readable. So the measurement is, Dad, did you read my book? So when I was drafting Racism Without Racism, which is now going to be in a 6th edition. So when I was drafting, in my mind, I had my dad telling me, hey man, this is like going through glue. So I finished the book. I was happy. I thought I had done a great job. And I asked my dad, hey dad, did you read the book? He told me, I read chapter 1. So I was like, well, better than book 1, where you only read 3 pages. I'm like, yeah, but you still need to bring it down. I'm like, hey, come on. My audience is college students mostly, and people in the academy, but maybe he has a point. So in that sense, my father has been central in pushing me to write and speak in a more clear manner.
Well, I want to move to talking about your work about Puerto Rico and race in Puerto Rico, but first, tell us a little bit also about the book White Logic and what you were trying to do there, and how you've been thinking about methods within race studies. You talk a little bit about the shift from survey-based research.
Yeah, so that book has it has 2 histories. The first history is this. I was working like a math person for 3 years, my first 3 years at Duke, 2005 to 2008, in gathering a story about how race was affected the sociological imagination. But in the midst of me working on that, I organized, along with my colleague Tukufu Zubeiri, a number of presentations in conferences. You know how this works. You organize a conference and a panel, and then another panel, and you have like 6, 8 papers, and then you decide, we have enough papers to put together an edited book. And I was the one who drafted the intro and the conclusion. And the argument is controversial in sociology, political science, and economics. Yeah, the argument that logic can be racialized and that methods can be white is a no-no in my field. But I think that we made the argument that actually, indeed, logic is a European project, yeah, and that we need to we need to use the plural. They're logics, yeah, and that the logics of the subaltern are seldom formalized as part of the canons in the academy, and that was part of our struggle, yeah, how to bring to the fore the work of people like Du Bois, Memi, and others, In methodology, my argument was, and still is, that a lot of the methods try to reify racism as something that you can, it's a thing. Racism is something you can measure, yeah? Same with race. And those of us who are in the constructivist tradition know that that is ridiculous, that race and racism are constructed and therefore change, and you cannot assume that race or racism work equally the same in formations. Yeah, Puerto Rico has race and racism, but the way in which race and racism is structured in Puerto Rico is different than in the US, which is different than the way that they're articulated in France or England or New Zealand. Yeah.
How has been the reception of the book? Because I feel it is such an important contribution, and one that resonates. I think a lot of folks will feel that, yes, we've been trying to, find our way to this argument and feeling that these methods are inadequate to the stories that we want to tell.
Well, it is 2 receptions. The mainstream hates the book. And as I told my co-author, who thought that they were to engage us, I said, the powerful don't win by engaging. They win by ignoring you. So for the most part, I know that they don't appreciate our arguments, but they are unlikely to rebut us by writing an article saying Zubeiri and Bonilla-Silva are full of it, because if they do that, they give us space to challenge them. Plus, as one colleague told me, which I'll remain unnamed, told me, oh, if I do that, they're going to call me racist. But then the younger cohorts, it's one of these books that is an interesting project because I think it's doing better today than when it was published. The other day, my publisher was asking me if I wanted to do a second edition. And I'm like, you know what? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I might go ahead and do it if I can engage other folks, because now in terms of the materials that I want to use, I would like to have chapters dealing with all this emphasis on big data and networks and computational sociology and all this stuff that I think is still racialized, like everything is, yeah? and that is sort of getting a pass. I would love to have new people in the chapters, yeah, addressing this, yeah. So.
Well, as I mentioned, one of our visiting scholars, Anna Michelle McSorley, she is at UCLA, and through the UCLA Center for the Study of Racism, Social Justice, and Health, they are doing a study group around, and they have a book club, the Anti-Colonialism Collective Virtual Book Club. And so they will be meeting on November 30th to discuss white logics. And so everyone in the audience should go sign up for that and continue the conversation there, because I think we absolutely need to think more critically about our methods and what they smuggle in. And as you said, there's been of late a lot of talk about how, you know, the algorithm is racist, like everything is racist because we are in a racist society, right? But I want to move to talk a little bit more about your writings about race in Puerto Rico, and maybe methodology can be an interesting transition to those conversations, because a lot of your pieces about race in Puerto Rico are very personal. To me, they read as almost autoethnography in the best sense of really using, you know, and theorizing from your personal experience. Can you tell me a little bit about, you know, these pieces? First, there's not that many of them. Those of us who follow your work, we have to dig and find the few pieces that you have written explicitly about Puerto Rico, although I think, you know, you would say Puerto Rico is always figuring in the background, right? Yeah. But so what has motivated these different pieces, and how have your approach to these been?
You call it is autoethnography. I begin all the pieces that I have written on race in Puerto Rico or Latin America begin with a very personal experience. And then from there I expand, because after all, I'm a sociologist, so I want to look at large patterns. So in the chapter for the Afro-Latino studies put together by the late Miriam Jimenez and Juan Flores, in that one, I begin with a story about me, all excited, talking to my father about, hey, I'm now a race scholar, I'm so excited. And my father tells me, eres un negrito acomplejado. You're a little black man with a complex. And then I'm not going to lie, I was furious, and I called him all kinds of names. And sort of in a stream of consciousness, told him, I remember when that woman in the shoe store refused to touch you because you were black. I remember your family members saying this and saying that. So it's a very personal entry point to address race, but you read the piece. So from there, I moved to that personal narrative to thinking both about race in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean and Latin America, to what happens to those people like me and you, Yarimar, raised in Puerto Rico, and then we come to La Entrañas del Monstruo, we come to the US, and then all of a sudden have to deal with the racism here, which is more acknowledged, more in your face, etc. And then how the kind of things that happen to us, which include gaining racial consciousness and being able now to see racialization back in our life and our experiences back home.
I think that piece is one of the most powerful ones for me personally. And I think that phrase of negrito acomplejado, or of, you know, I think that's such a common experience in Puerto Rico when you point out to a racial problem or racial discrimination that you've either experienced or seen, to be called acomplejado. And again, this kind of individualization, not, you know, we talked earlier about, you know, the individualization of people who perpetuate racist acts, but there's also an individualization of people who experience racial discrimination, as if it's up to them to shift their perspective, right? And I, you know, I've thought about this. I feel like it's almost a way of focusing on what you can do, since you can't change, you know, since there's no understanding of the systemic problem of racism in Puerto Rico, everything is individualized. Yeah.
Or the need for a collective project of resistance, yeah? Because if it's a matter of individual stuff, they tell you, hey, get educated and everything will be okay.
So I share a lot of these thoughts, but one thing that I come up against all the time is that there's, how to make these arguments without, in fact, importing that American racial, lens in a way that would suggest that in Puerto Rico and in Latin America, people do race wrong, as if there was a correct way of doing race, right? And just suggesting a kind of false consciousness.
We have to understand, I tell my own students, when someone tells you I am not Black in Puerto Rico, or the Dominican Republic, or anywhere in Latin America, don't read race based on the US category of race. What you need to understand is what are the rules and regulations of race formation in Latin America and in that specific context. So for example, you and I know that in Puerto Rico, besides, first, most people refuse Black as their category, yeah? And in that context, then the struggle is that we have a third category. Yeah? We have this category trigueño, which is analogous in South America and Central America to the mestizos, yeah, to the Latinos, to the in-betweeners.
Something that I've been trying to think through with my colleague Isar Godreau. We've written, Isar has written a lot about race in Puerto Rico, and we think a lot together about how these racial identities might be shifting in the context of the debt crisis, the racialized experiences of Hurricane Maria. And so the most recent census results raise a lot of questions about shifting racial identity in Puerto Rico and in the United States as well, where we see in both places a move away from kind of pure the kind of one-drop rule idea of whiteness, and more towards white in combination with other identities, or of mixed identities in general, kind of being ascendant. How do you see those shifts?
I'm going to confess, I'm not too sure that we can read a direct line from census results, because census are also constructed, well, everything is constructed, but in the case of the census, it's just someone making a mark. So I would be more interested in now following through with people to see what do they mean when they mark in the census, I am mixed, yeah? Because we know that there is a long trajectory of mestizaje thinking, of racial mixing thinking, that it still maintains white supremacy notions, yeah? So moving from I'm white to I'm mestizo does not necessarily mean I am moving a progressive tradition. It may mean a number of things. So it's an empirical thing for us to begin now following through from the census results to the streets. Now, you are right, and I would be a fool if not acknowledge that from my early time when there was zero space to talk about race, now the space is open. There is a crack open. Now we have a center that just was established this year, yeah?
The Afro-Descendencia program at UPR.
Which is great.
As far as I understand it, I don't think it's really a center, it's a program, it's an academic, a major Black Studies program.
And for you and I, it's an empirical thing. Let's see how it works, how many students enroll, what kind of impact it has. Again, when I was in the University of Puerto Rico in the late 70s, early 80s, there was no space. Now at least there are courses. Yeah. At the time, I remember what's the name of the professor who wrote that book? Narciso Descubre su Trasero.
Zenon, yeah.
Isabelo Zenon was his name. So Isabelo Zenon would walk on campus as an unknown person, even though he had wrote this fundamental important book. But he was viewed, again, by some of his colleagues, he was viewed as a negrito acomplejado. So at the time, sort of the Black people in the academy that were sort of, again, using our rules of Blackness, he was Black, so was Professor Ferrer, who was in the Departamento de Estudios Hispánicos, yeah? But there were few and far in between people who were sort of Black. Everybody was white or mestizo, and that's it. So there was no space. Now we have people who self-proclaim their Blackness and are trying to teach courses on race, that is good.
It's this idea of Isabelo Zenon being viewed as a complejado, I think, you know, it gets back to that question of the methods, because so many folks who write about race in Puerto Rico, because of you know, the lack of methods for studying this, you have to center your personal experience, right? But then that centering of personal embodied knowledge, you know, which I think also collectives like the Black Latinas Know collective, you know, kind of assert this idea that there is a kind of embodied knowledge from having lived through this experience that is brought to the study of race in Puerto Rico and elsewhere, and that helps fill in some of those methodological gaps, but it can be a double-edged sword, right? Used to downplay the importance of the scholarship.
I know that you had this question on music. So musically, since I left Puerto Rico, reggaeton emerged. So reggaeton has all kinds of problems, but it was among the first musical forms to tackle the issue of racism in a straightforward manner. What's his name? The guy from Loíza. Tego Calderón. Tego Calderón started putting lyrics that were like, wow, people are talking deeply about race, yeah? But I'm old enough to remember when the essay came that changed things dramatically, El País de los Cuatro Pisos by José Luis González. And the País de los Cuatro Pisos was a challenge for nationalists, for the socialists, for everybody, because it was making the claim that Puerto Rico at the core has this Black foundation. And that was something that everybody had to sort of battle and engage. And thankfully, unlike what happened to my book, White Logic, White Methods, that essay, El País de los Cuatro Pisos, generated years of discussion and engagement. And for some of us, so I remember reading that as I am about to graduate, and it was one of the first sort of pieces of scholarship that sort of brought the race question to the forefront and problematized the traditional nationalist, white-oriented thinking of Puerto Rican formation. Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely remember my engagement with that text as well, and I can see in my mind the cover of the essay I wrote about it in grad school. It was definitely a touchstone text. Were there any other texts about race in Puerto Rico that have been foundational to your thinking?
Well, I read broadly, and I read among Puerto Rican scholars. I always read you and Isa Goudreau, and I read sociologists. I don't know if you know him, Jorge Giovannetti, Hilda Llorensis is her last name. And I read anything on race. And you know, I'm based in the US, so I depend on the internet. So I go and do my searches, and anything on race, I'm reading, you know. But I also read increasingly, you know this, the literature on race and racism in Latin America used to be limited. Now there is an explosion of work. I read broadly beyond Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. Now, one name that I want to mention, a person that I think is doing important work, is Silvio Torres, who works in Syracuse. He's Dominican. And he's just wonderful. So his work, I find it very illuminating. And because Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic have some similarities. So when I read his work, I'm able to say, oh, this is like in Puerto Rico. This is like, you see my notes, and I'm in many ways, I'm still a nationalist. So every time I read anything, it's like, oh, this reminds me of Puerto Rico, you know.
So given that nationalism, how does your thinking about Puerto Rico, race in Puerto Rico figure when you're not writing about Puerto Rico? What do you think that the work that you've written could have been written by someone who wasn't Puerto Rican, or is there ways in which that's always influencing?
No one is indispensable. But I'm thinking, for example, my work on the Latin Americanization of race stratification in the USA, an argument that I put together in the late 20th century, early 21st century. And that argument could not have been written or done by anyone who doesn't have knowledge and experience about how race is transacted in Latin America, yeah? So in that argument, I claimed that the US was moving to a Latin America-like formation, where rather than having white, non-white, that biracial divide, we were going to become sort of triracial, yeah? Having whites at the top, an in-between category, and again, thinking Puerto Rico, the in-between category, the trigueños. In the US, I claim this group that I call honorary whites, and at the bottom, a group that I call the collective Black. So that argument that is about the US has the deep imprint of my background in Puerto Rico.
So in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip a few questions here, but I do have to ask you a little bit to tell us about your experiences during the pandemic. How was that experience for you personally, and how are you seeing it also as a scholar?
Hard, very hard, because you know, we are all creatures of habit, yeah? So my habit as an academic began in college. In college, I would go to the library and spend hours in the library. When I became a professor, all of a sudden I have an office. I'm like, wow, I have an office. So that meant that I became incarcerated in my office. My office became my cave. And what happened? The first thing that happened with the pandemic is you cannot go to campus. And I'm like, what? How do I work? Oh, you can work from home. I'm like, how? I have my books in my office. Some of you relate to this. Younger folks will not, but older folks, I'm still book bound, yeah? And at the moment that I was getting happy 2 months ago, that I thought this is over, now I can go back to regular life and travel and give talks, then things went back, and now we're all like, they're telling us that things are improving, but we are all afraid, yeah? So I technically have to travel, or I have to travel to Puerto Rico in a month, and I'm afraid. I shouldn't, because I'm vaccinated.
And as a scholar, and specifically a scholar who works on race, how are you thinking intellectually about the pandemic?
Well, I did write, you know, that's what we do. So I wrote a paper on, so you begin watching a lot of TV in the pandemic because you want to know what is going on. And it struck me, things that were being said, like everybody was celebrating our heroes. Yeah, you remember, our heroes, the workers and our heroes. And I kept thinking, what is this about? So I ended up putting together a paper titled Colorblind Racism in Pandemic Times. And I claimed that colorblindness as an ideology has to be flexible and accept and incorporate new themes, new possibilities. So one of them was this notion of heroes. And I claimed that here the heroes were part of the colorblind drama, because the more we talk about heroes, the less we talk about, hey, most of those people you are heralding as heroes happen to be people of color, underpaid workers. So rather than heroes, why don't you pay them better? Why don't you give them hazard pay, yeah? And by the way, you know that they're more exposed to the virus, so we can be all happy. So in that paper, I attempted to sort of deconstruct the main themes of the pandemic, including the health discussion, yeah, about who dies and who doesn't die, and race.
Before turning to the Q&A, just like a fun question. So what is the last great book you read, or film you watched, or song that you're listening to on repeat? What are you thinking and listening to right now?
Okay, films is easy. I used to go to the movies every weekend, and the pandemic changed everything. So since the pandemic changed my habits, I haven't watched a movie in 2 years. Music, I used to be a Nueva Trova. I used to be un quedao. I was stuck in the past, in the Nueva Trova that became old Trova, yeah, of people like Silvio, Pablo, Roy Brown, etc. But I have to also confess, I'm a romantico decadente. So the music of the 50s, I still keep thinking about the music of Odilio González, Ódiame por Piedad, and Gilberto Monroy, Imposible Amor, or José Feliciano, La Copa Rota. That's the music, or Quique Tomás, el dúo Quique Tomás. I listen to the music all the time. Book-wise, again, I read the obligatory books that everybody read in the last 2 years. The Candy's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and the Angelos book, White Fragility. But the book that really struck me, and it's a book that I have been advising people to read, is the book How to Hide an Empire by a historian called Daniel Immerwahr. And it's a book about the US as an empire, because the US is a peculiar imperial state because the beginning of imperial expansion was internal to what we call today the US. So the US kept expanding the border, and we have translated that as the process of expansion to the West, which is called imperialism. Yeah? We don't call it imperialism, but that's what it was. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. That's been a key text for me as well, and kind of hammers a line that I like to cite from a bad movie that says, "What the American people don't know is what makes them the American people." So I think that the kind of historical silencing that the U.S. has experienced around its own imperial history is part of what allows, the current policy that we have today. Well, thank you so much for this, Eduardo. I'm excited to open it up to Q&A and engage with our audience. I'm sure they have really interesting questions for you as well. So let's turn to that.
Hola, Eduardo. Thank you so much. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed doing it. We have a couple of questions in the chat. In the Q&A box. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. The chat is just to express your emotions. So let me start with this one, Eduardo, because we have a good number of questions. So Amber Henry asks, you mentioned the importance of not mapping US racial context onto Latin America. In this vein, what would you like to see African-American scholars doing work in Afro-Latin American communities do or keep in mind? I think that's a great question.
It is a great question. And I think that the number one thing they should do, as I mentioned in the conversation, is that respecting the history of race formation in Latin America means not assuming. So for example, they see a person that they phenotypically read as Black, the person doesn't exhibit what they call Black consciousness, and immediately, oh, this person is race traitor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the more interesting analysis would be to realize and study race formation in a particular community, whether it is the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico, or among the group that she calls Afro-Latinos, yeah? So that element of attempting to be plural and appreciate that we in Latin America have 100 years more of race formation, and perhaps the way that race works in our country, in our countries today, maybe the work that the US will have race formation in the future. So rather than trying to force us or read us through the US experience, maybe learn from if you want to avoid the racial democracy nonsense of Brazil, Puerto Rico, etc. If you want to avoid the racismo solapado, then learn about how is that those things emerge, rather than going immediately and saying, no, you are wrong, yeah? So learn rather than trying to impose an analysis based on the US experience, which after all, is a shorter race experience than ours.
Thank you. So let me see, Isar Godro writes, what do you say to people who say the solution to racism is education? What kind of other solutions or strategic actions could be suggested to make people ponder about tackling systemic aspects of racism? Great question, Isar.
Yeah, Isar, as a sociologist, that's one of the number one things that I have been critical of, yeah? If racism were a matter of having bad data, bad information, then in terms of the US, since the proportion of people with education has increased over the years, one would expect the significance of discrimination and racism to have declined. In truth, what we have had is a change in the way that race matters, but the impact of race and racism in the life chances of everybody, not just people of color, but whites. Let's remember also, the race formation is not about things that happen to Black and brown people. they also happen positively to white people, yeah? So, okay, so what are the options? If the issue is not a problem of misinformation and not having the right level of education, then it's a matter of power relations. That's what I have been arguing in my work, yeah? And the power is held, has been held by whites for a long, long time. So we need to think is what kind of policies and politics we need to advance to produce a truly democratic and inclusive polity. Yeah? That's not what we have, yeah? By the way, as a side note, part of the drama in the contemporary landscape of the academy is that you can produce a diversity discourse or think about all these automatic or implicit bias arguments that ultimately deny the centrality of racism as a social force, yeah? So, because if you claim that it's all implicit and it's something that is cognitively or actually subconscious, then you don't appreciate the significance of real practices of exclusion, yeah? So that's my answer to that question. Thank you, Isaac.
So I think this might be the last question, unless, oh wait, they're popping up again. But William Garcia Medina has a paragraph long question. So I will try my best and maybe copy it into the chat also. So here I go. Although Blackness and Black racial identity as a framework of study has been increasing in Latino and Latin American studies, white Latin American, white Latino studies has been deeply ignored. Critical whiteness studies has been reduced to the United States and global North. Although denying your whiteness and white racial identity was celebrated after the civil rights, many Afro-Latino scholars, educators, and activists have been demanding a transnational and nuanced examination of white racial domination. Although many non-Black and Indigenous scholars continue to deny the importance of this subject, who are the majority scholars in the field, how should we apply Dr. Bonilla-Silva's frames of colorblind racism in a transnational context of whiteness studies within Latino, Caribbean, and Latin American studies? That was a question/dissertation, but thank you, William. I will put it in the chat.
Thank you, William, for that question. And, hola, William. So we invented color blindness. It wasn't the Americans who invented color blindness. We in Latin America and the Caribbean have articulated colorblind logic, and the language is different. We call it democracia racial, racial democracy, etc. In terms of whiteness, you are right, William. So we need to expand the discussion on whiteness. And William, like you, I share your concern that we sort of talk about, if there is a way that you can talk about Blackness as sort of, oh, poor Black people, yeah, without understanding that if you have Blackness, you also have whiteness. It's a relational element, and there is a power dynamic. And actually, I think that the whiteness studies as a genre of subfield of analysis would actually benefit enormously from sort of reading whiteness racial formation in Latin America. In the preparation for this discussion, Yarimar and I were talking, and I was telling her that one of the things that we should do in Latin America is literally study what anthropologists call the process of ethnogenesis, yeah? So a lot of people who were not white, let's say in the 18th century, through a number of very specific practices, were able to achieve racial mobility. And you can trace family histories and use the family histories to show how people became white. So in terms of whiteness studies, that would be a fundamental shift, yeah? Because a lot of the whiteness studies in the US assume that people are white upon arrival, yeah? Because they have a phenotypical capital. But in Latin American formation, a lot of the people who are today white were not white, their families, 100, 200 years ago. In Puerto Rico, think about families like the Betances family, yeah? So, our national hero, yeah, who is a mulatto, and if we're able to follow his family movement from the Dominican Republic to Puerto Rico, yeah, we then can find that family process of being Black and then becoming mulatto, and then later sort of becoming white. So.
Okay, so let me bundle a few questions here. Onaje Muid, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, had a couple of questions. He asked, kind of, can we include Don Pedro Albizu Campos in the discussion? I don't know if you've thought about him in relation to race in Puerto Rico. Onaje also asked, can you explain the current status of the Afro-Puerto Rican movement in Puerto Rico and its connections to Afro-Puerto Ricans in the US? I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Eduardo. And let me throw in a couple of things here that you can pick and choose what you want to close with. But Miguel Juarez had asked how it was working at a conservative institution like Texas A&M, and if that impacted your journey. They have personal experience at A&M. And then I think and Norma Marti asked if you've ever collaborated with any HBCU faculty. So if you want to tackle any of those, feel free, Eduardo.
Okay, I'm getting old. The first question was about what? Let me begin with the first one.
Albizu.
Okay, got it.
HBCUs and Black movements, Puerto Rico, US. Yeah.
Let me go Albizu. So we all know that Albizu was a mulatto, but the nationalist movement for a long time tried to sort of sell him as sort of a white-like, even though he couldn't be. So I grew up in the period where the nationalists, the people who sort of inherited the Partido Nacionalista, the Nationalist Party, Juan Antonio Correa and company, even though they tried to sort of expand the discussion, they expanded racially in terms of Indians, not blacks. So those of you familiar with Juan Antonio Correa, their great poetry, yeah, it's all about the Indians, even though and it's not something for us to be happy, but the Indians in Puerto Rico, for the most part, were exterminated. They may be part of our DNA, as studies have shown, but Puerto Rico is not Bolivia or Mexico or any other country where the Indian presence is significantly bigger, yeah, both culturally as well as phenotypically, yeah. So, okay, so part of the discussion of blackness in Puerto Rico is rereading Pedro Albizu Campos. And there is a professor, I'm forgetting his name, sociologist at Binghamton, who wrote a nice paper on Pedro Albizu Campos, sort of reading the history of Albizu Campos and his connection to sugarcane workers, race, etc. You know, so I think that that's one of the discussions. The second question was about the connection between the Puerto Rican Black movement and the U.S. I confess I'm not that connected to the discussion in Puerto Rico. That's part of la tragedia del emigrado, the tragedy of the migrants. Yeah, that is really hard to keep it together. And in my subfield, Yarimar, sociology is a peculiar discipline. Yeah, so very imperialist. So the idea that you make a career doing stuff on Puerto Rico in sociology is like, what? They don't count. Yeah, but it's sociology is a very Eurocentric discipline. So if I were writing about France, people would be like, ooh la la, he's writing about France. But Puerto Rico, I mean, I can be writing about Nigeria. I can be writing about African politics, and people are like, whatever. But I write about the Netherlands or France or England, and people go wild. Oh, that is deep, yeah? So I have been forced somewhat to stick within the US boundaries, and lately, as Yarimar and I have been discussing, I'm slowly moving and trying to do more work in Latin America and sort of reading broadly, and hopefully at some point, I tell you this, I will not be a happy camper until I deconstruct or at least participate deeply in the discussion of race formation in Puerto Rico. So I have been reading broadly, and hopefully at some point I'll put something. I already wrote a little article, Aquí no hay racismo, there is no racism here, apuntes preliminares de lo racial en las Américas, based on a lecture, a talk I gave in Chile a few years ago. So that's my beginning of migrating. Yeah, I'm still a scholar in transition. Yeah, HBCUs. I have not collaborated on projects or papers, but I do have plenty of colleagues and that simpaticos, and we communicate. if the person send me the note or ask a question because she or he is interested in collaborating, send me an email and let's see if we can do something together.
So one final question that I find really interesting. Amber Henry asks, do you continue to see value in contemporary studies of resistance? If not, what other forms of agentive self-making do you find valuable in current racial studies? For instance, some anthropologists have turned to refusal as an alternative, while Isar Godreau pushes for us to think of challenges, to refer to the ways in which racialized people accommodate racial scripts while simultaneously challenging others. So where do you stand on this? How can we think about agentive positions in relation to race studies?
I grew up as my social formation, my sociological background, my political background has been social movement stuff. So I'm still sort of connected to the idea that if we want to change the world, we need to get organized. At the same time, and this is part of, we all learn as we move on in this trajectory in the academy and in life. So besides my belief that we got to get organized and develop social movements, collective action, as central to changing the world in terms of race, class, gender, etc., all the categories of domination. I now, unlike 20, 30 years ago, I now believe more in the personal stuff, yeah? The following the Fanon and following other people about, emancipation, mental emancipation, yeah? Because in many ways, and I don't want to get emotional, but we're not, race is such a powerful, and racism are such powerful categories that even in the resistance, you incorporate, yeah? So people call that internalized racism, etc. I think in the discussion, Yarimar, I mentioned to you how I was forced for many, many years to usar brillantina, to use, ¿cómo se dice brillantina en inglés?
I forget.
I remember the product I used, Vitalis, yeah? So me ponía brillant, I would put brillantina, I ponerme una media, and do all kinds of things.
Google Translate says it's just brillantin. I don't know if that's
Brillantina, yeah. So
pomade, hair grease.
It's a pomade, yeah, a pomade. So we do all kinds of things, and I want to confess, and maybe some of you can relate to that. So you fight, you resist, but unfortunately, the race formation has ways of affecting even not only your cognitions, but also your feelings, your affections, and even your sense of aesthetics. So then part of the resistance, besides engaging in collective action, is to try to remove from your soul the impact, the negative impact of white supremacy in your feelings, in your aesthetics, in your preferences, yeah, etc. So personally, I've been fighting the monster of racism within me. I don't know if I've been completely successful, but at least I'm willing to talk and say things today that I know that 20, 30 years ago, I would not even think. And even if it was there somewhere in the recesses of my mind and soul, I would not allow it to come up. Now, for example, talking about my mother and some of the way that race shaped our family dynamics is stuff that I was not able to explain and discuss 20, 30 years ago. Now, I think it's central because it's not enough for you to fight the fight externally. You also have to fight the fight internally.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. Thank you for our conversation tonight. And thank you for your incredible body of work and the way that you put yourself in your work and let us peek into who you are and what has shaped your thinking. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who connected.
Muchas gracias. Alegría muchos tostones.
Thank you for attending, everyone. We are so happy to have such a wonderful turnout, and we hope that you all enjoyed the fabulous conversation between Eduardo and Yarimar. We would love to hear from you, of course, and we want to know what you thought about tonight's tertulia. It helps us plan future events if we know what you liked and what you might not have liked, or what you would like to see done differently. Again, we also invite you to RSVP for our 2 upcoming events next week, our library lunch hour on how to use the Centro archives, and our Afternon Tertulia on decolonizing solidarity, the historical relationship between the African American community and the Puerto Rican community, and how they've come together to work towards decolonizing Puerto Rico. We also want to invite you to join us to discuss Eduardo's book, White Logic, White Methods, on Tuesday, November 30th. I will drop the link in the chat where you can RSVP to join the Anti-Colonialism Collective virtual book club. Read the book and join the conversation because it is sure to be amazing. We thank you again for coming, and we hope to see you at our next Tertulia.